My castaway this week was born in Manchester just before the war and brought up in a loving home in the Gorton area. He was awarded a bursary which took him to the prestigious Manchester Grammar School, which led him to studying physics at Bristol University and then on to Sheffield Medical Physics Department studying radiotherapy. He then spent 14 rewarding years in general practice as a doctor. He was the first full-time medical director at Ashgate Hospice in Chesterfield until his retirement. But work did not stop there. He threw himself into community and charitable activities in the Dronfield area, for which he and wife Jill were awarded an MBE. Blessed with 2 children and a gaggle of grandchildren who are all overseas, well, I've just skated over the details of an incredible and interesting life. The life story of Tony Bethell. Tony, welcome to COVID Island Discs.
Thank you. Thank you for the outing to the island, away from all the lockdowns.
Well, I hope you get a bit of escapism during your time talking with me, at least. It's good to be able to speak to another human being, isn't it? Even if it's through the wonders of technology.
Yeah.
So what I didn't mention in the intro, Tony, is that you are also a licensed lay minister or reader in the Church of England. And how long have you been doing that?
Almost 50 years.
50?
50 years in May.
Goodness me.
So I've seen 1 or 2 bishops and even more vicars and rectors.
And obviously your license, like Ian Price last week, covers the whole parish, but your principal, your main church, if you like, is St. John's in Dronfield. How did you end up there?
Well, it's part of the story of coming to Sheffield and to Dronfield. When I first started working in Sheffield in 1960, I used to commute home for the weekends because my father had a do-it-yourself shop there that needed extra help. But after a few years, I got tired of paying what I call wasted money to someone renting a flat to me. And with family's agreement, I bought this house on Homely Lane.
Okay.
Modern semi. It's been built about 4 years before I bought it. And I bought it for the princely sum of 2,400. I was told by the neighbours I'd been done because they were built in 1750. And of course, having moved to Dronfield, I then looked around for a local church, and I'd been going to the Church of England in Manchester. So happened on the parish church when it was in chaos because they were replacing the roof. They'd just taken the 10 Commandments down. Which in those days I think was a bit of a sin, but the Death Watch beetle had got there, so it was declared beyond repair, and they got permission to leave it down.
Right, well, and that was obviously quite a few years ago, and you've been involved with the church ever since, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But tell us about your first piece of music, Tony.
Well, this takes me back to Manchester and school days in a strange way. There's nothing at all to do with me except my interest in using music as background for things like slideshows or the magnificent Sonny Lumiere, which we did in the parish church a few years ago. But somewhere along the line, I suspect through something commercial, I came across Carmina Burana because there's some striking music in that. And when I got the CD, I turned it over, and to my amazement, amongst the performers were boys of Manchester Grammar School. Now, I'm glad to say it was never due to me that they sang in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, because I've never been a singer. But this Carmina Burana, I think it's got some striking music in it, as you'll hear. But when I looked into it, it's a strange piece of music because it was set by Carl Orff in the late 1800s, I think. but the actual words go back to the 12th and 13th centuries, written by clergy.
Right.
But they weren't clergy like yourself. That yes, they were part of the church, but they were, the younger sons who weren't allowed to go in the army or anything.
Right.
So they then turned to the church, and some of them were, by the sound of it, quite rascals. So Carmina Burana is a collection of sometimes fairly bawdy songs. I've not looked into all the wording of them, and thankfully you won't be able to hear it now. But here's a wonderful piece of rousing music to get the palm trees waving.
It's a rousing piece of music, isn't it, nonetheless?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so going back a bit then to your early years, how did you come from Manchester, and then how did you end up becoming a Christian? Were you brought up in the faith?
Yes, I was brought up, and it was in my very early days that really my ecumenical streak began, because I was baptized into the Church of England, where my parents were living at the time for about 6 months, near the Gorton Locomotive Works, which was a big feature of Manchester in those days. And then they moved back to my father's stamping area, where he'd grown up with his family just round the corner. His grandfather had fallen out with the local Anglican church because it got so high. So I went to the local Methodist Sunday school, where I spent, probably 10 happy years until I was about 14, when they got a new vicar at St. Chad's, who seemed a very nice young guy and was looking for confirmation candidates, inevitably.
Yeah.
I must have come visiting. So the next thing, I was confirmed and finished up as a server and very much involved in that church before I went off to Bristol University.
Right.
And there, of course, through friends who invited me to the Christian Union, I got involved in all sorts of activities there. But I remember one time just asking a close friend of mine who was doing physics as well, why God demanded a sacrifice. And he pointed out some of the Old Testament scriptures to me. And it wasn't a flash of lightning, but it was a change of direction, in the sense that my Christian faith became personal to me then, rather than something that I'd inherited.
So linking with those Bristol University days, tell us about your second piece of music.
Well, the second piece of music is very much a reminder of those days, because having an interest in the technical side of music, somehow I finished up being asked to record one of the Bristol University choral groups who were singing in Bristol Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
That was a fascinating experience, because I was parked up on one of the little narrow stone walkways above the nave, but looking right down in the way you can from a lot of the cathedrals. And I was stuck up there with this guy's big ferrograph reel-to-reel recorder, hardly able to see. And we did a rehearsal in the afternoon, and I thought I'd got it set right, and we'd record it in the evening. But in the darkness, I realized that we were overloading the input on the recording, so I turned it down. What I didn't realize until I was taken to task afterwards was that I was turning down a wonderful crescendo at just about the same rate as they were crescendoing. So I was not a popular bunny.
There you go.
I agree. I'm sure everyone will agree. It's a wonderful piece of music, wonderful crescendo. And of course, it's Dvorak's Stabat Mater. The story of Mary standing at the cross watching her son die. There's an interesting story apparently behind the writing of this, that Dvorak had only recently got married, and their first child only lived for 2 days. And that's when he started writing this, just in his own grief, effectively sharing Mary's grief. And then he put it on one side, wrote other things. They had 2 more children, and then suddenly a double tragedy, because the young daughter drank a cup of phosphorus that they used in those days for making their own matches.
Goodness.
And then just a fortnight later, the older brother, Ottokar, died of smallpox. He was only aged 3. And it reminds us that all these diseases that are just names to us now, like smallpox, were real killers. Even influenza, as we've been reminded recently, during the COVID outbreak.
Yeah.
So the whole background to that is someone in grief, as many people are today.
Thank you, Tony. That's very fitting, isn't it, for now? So, what has your year been like, Tony, on COVID Island? Have you how have you coped, and has music been a help to you?
Oh yes, particularly music that I've heard from from the various churches, and also inevitably things just come into your mind, or when you're reading things that people have written or reading scriptures, suddenly it's amazing how a tune will come into your mind and you think, why on earth has that happened? But there was a wonderful comment in this week's Radio Times from none other than Mr. Bean himself, who said, music lubricates life. And I think in a sense that's very true. I think it lubricates it, inspires it, and it's a way of expressing all sorts of emotions. So on our COVID island, it's been really a bit similar to normal life, because we live a bit secluded from folk. So really, apart from discouraging folk from coming in the early days, we've just carried on. And like many people in the first lockdown, we did a lot of clearing up. And then, of course, couldn't get rid of it because the tips were closed and you couldn't put things on eBay, etc.
You mentioned to me, and obviously probably quite a lot of people know that you live there in Unston in Ramshaw Lodge, and you've used that home as a blessing to other people, haven't you? In the sense of the community work you've done, the events that used to take place there in Ramshaw Lodge, and music was a part of that as well, wasn't it?
It was, and of course, Ramshaw was our third home. When I first moved to Dronfield, I mentioned the house on Homely Lane, remote from all the churches. We were surrounded by young families, as ours was, and we started a little home Sunday school there.
Right.
Which, when we moved down to Green Lane, opposite the grammar school, we handed over to the top chapel, to Muriel and Co.
Right.
And yes, Muriel is still looking after people up there.
That's nice.
None of our moves have been planned, but certainly the last one was a huge blessing, getting Ramshaw. And the following year, after we moved in the November, because I knew, having been church warden, there was a small congregation at St. Mary's. We managed to put together a garden party here called a Teddy Bear's Picnic, which drew together people from St. John's and St. Mary's in a way that they perhaps hadn't before. And the events just have grown from that to some of the huge ones we've had in more recent years, until we, and a lot of our helpers began to feel that we hadn't quite the energy we used to have.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that shortly. But first of all, let's talk about your third piece of music.
I think of all music, organ music is one of the types that I like most. And I've chosen this one because, again, there's quite a story to it. It's a well-known piece, Vidas Toccata. Yeah. And when Jill and I were getting married, which happened down in Sussex in a little tiny church in Sompting, near where her parents were living, I'd set my heart on having Vidas Toccata. And the message came back via Jill's family that if we insisted on it, they'd find the one person in Sussex who might be able to play it on the little organ in Sompting.
Right.
So we settled for something a little bit easier that was recommended by the local organist. But that's why Vidas Toccata sticks in my mind, and I'm sure everyone will recognise it and be lifted up by it. Just
Yeah,
wish I could play the organ.
yeah. I expect that's even beyond Rob Aldridge's capabilities, isn't it? You know,
Well, I'm sure he'd have a good stab at it.
I'm sure he would. So, being a Christian, as I say to everyone, is not always easy. But there are some real highlights. I'm sure that you must have a lifetime of things you could pick from, Tony, where you would say, "I was just so pleased that I found the Lord and that I've received these blessings." But can you think of a particular occasion or time when you felt really good being part of the church?
I still well remember we'd gone over to see our daughter Linda and family, who were at that time working in Bolivia, and we'd gone across to Chile for a joint family holiday, because they very rarely got a family holiday.
Mm.
And somehow on the long road journey over to the coast on Chile, the young daughter, their only daughter, suddenly went very ill. She was admitted, thankfully, to a first-class hospital in Chile, where there was obviously something going wrong in her brain, and they thought that she wouldn't survive.
Mm.
So Jill, of course, was with Linda in the hospital. I was left on the sands, trying to make sandcastles and entertain the kids, who, of course, at that age had very little idea what was going on. And I was, digging sandcastles and praying fervently at the same time.
Yeah.
And thanks to our Lord, she could pull through amazingly.
Yeah.
And a couple of weeks later, she flew back with us to the capital of Chile to have further examinations before they would allow her back to Bolivia. And she was happily sat at the aircraft window saying, "Look, there's a map down there."
Right.
And it was just so unbelievable, the change in just a couple of weeks. But that's young kids.
Incredible. So tell us, that's a wonderful to hear that, Tony. Tell us about your fourth piece of music.
Well, this again draws together many threads, events that have been involved in church, as well as here at Ramshaw. There was a spell when there were the Elysian singers, which really were the predecessors to some of the choirs that Rob's got going now. And they did all sorts of different concerts, concerts for the summer, concerts for Christmas. And this particular one, bless them, it was Ken Ellis who was the organist and choir master in those days, and he agreed to do one for me for the St. John Eye Hospital in Jerusalem. Now, at the time, I was the Derbyshire representative for the St. John Eye Hospital in Jerusalem, which in itself is a whole book full of stories, because when it was founded by the Order of St. John, it was the only specialist eye hospital in the whole of the Middle East. And I got involved in supporting and went around speaking about it. And Ken and the singers did this wonderful concert in church. A whole 23 tracks, believe it or not, of very well known light music, some specifically Christian, some rather not so. And this particular piece ties that concert up with a very well known little song, and also that very first event here that I mentioned, the Teddy Bear's Picnic. So when we hear the music, you'll understand.
If you go down to the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down to the woods today, you better go in disguise. For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic. Oh,
evoking some wonderful memories for people who perhaps have been to Ramshaw Lodge for those sorts of events. A long way from these winter days.
Yes, but still part of a fun life together.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant. So Tony, being a medical man and also a man of God who's brought the word of God to us, surely you've got some good survival tips for our time on COVID Island. What can you share with us?
I think probably I'd just reiterate one of the things I looked at in a thought for the day quite early on in the first lockdown, of looking up.
Mm.
I still remember a little ditty that my mother instilled into me when I was quite tiny. Two men looked out from prison bars. One saw mud and the other saw stars. So even though we're in prison again because of COVID, we can either look down at the mud and the difficulties, or we can look up to the Lord and the future.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you, Tony. There's so much more we could have spoken about, but time is what it is. And, you're on the island. You've got some things to keep you going. As usual, for all of our guests, you get to take with you the complete works of Graham Kendrick. What do you think of Graham's songs? Are you a fan?
Well, yes, because I suppose I was very much involved in active things when his music was so very helpful to the church and to Christians generally.
Yeah, he is good. I sort of tease him a bit, but he's got some fantastic songs.
Yes.
You also get the Bible, of course, and a book of your choice. Which book would you take?
Well, believe it or not, I would take one called Walking in the Dust of Rabbi Jesus.
Okay.
Some folk may say, oh, that sounds a bit heavy and theological, but it was an eye-opener for me because it's someone who is a Jew who goes through some of Jesus's teachings and life, looking at it, against his Jewish background, because we often forget Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah.
And suddenly this makes so much more sense of a lot of the things he said and did in the context in which he lived. So you see much more the relevance of it today. So I'd happily settle down with that again.
Now, before I ask you to choose your one of your 5 discs to take, we need to actually hear your last piece of music, Tony. So what is that? Tell us about it.
Well, as you gather, I've been really blessed by the churches all down through my life, and through vicars. I mean, I still look to Richard Sledge, who was Vicar of Dronfield, before the days of St Andrews and St Philip's. He was such a godly man who had such an influence on my young life then that I'll always treasure him, as I've treasured the other different vicars and their different approaches. And one of the things, particularly through taking even songs, which lay readers seem to get landed with very often, there's one piece that we always sing there that increasingly now means a lot to me. It's old Simeon's song, when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple as just a young child. And he said, Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace, for my eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. So I'm hoping that they'll sing that at whatever funeral or memorial service they eventually have for me.
Yeah.
I should be there in spirit, I trust. But a variation on that came to me just before Christmas, when Sheffield Chorale, of which we're patrons, sent a wonderful online sort of mosaic song that they'd done together. which was Go Ye Now in Peace.
Hmm.
I haven't had permission to use their recording, but my last piece of music is another lovely recording of these words that I think should mean so much to us at the present time. Go ye now in peace, and know that the love of God will guide you. Feel his presence here beside you, showing you the way.
I think that's just the perfect one to finish on, isn't it, Tony?
It is, and it's the one I would keep with me on the desert island.
It is. I was going to ask, that's a lovely thing, isn't it? To think of as you sort of on the island, keeping you in peace, even in a difficult time, which is what we need right now, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Tony, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have you on COVID Island Discs. I wish we could have had more. Perhaps we'll do an extended version at some other future point. But God bless you, and go in peace, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.